For the n-Lorem Foundation, N of 1 doesn't mean alone because every patient matters. Hope for nano-rare patients and their families has never been more within reach. Visit n-Lorem.org today to donate and make hope possible. This episode of the n-Lorem Patient Empowerment Program podcast is proudly sponsored by Hanjin Biotech. With more than 26 years of experience in the nucleic acid industry, Hanjin is a specialized CDMO and raw material supplier committed to providing high-quality and high-value products and services with the best-in-class lead times.
Hello and welcome to the n-Lorem podcast series. I'm Stan Crook, and I'm your host of the podcast series, and I'm chairman and CEO of n-Lorem. The n-Lorem podcast series is a podcast series that is devoted to the needs of nano-rare patients and their families. And today we have a special guest who I know reasonably well, and most of you probably know her at least at some level, and that's Sarah Glass, who is the Chief Operating Officer at n-Lorem. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you, Stan. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, this does feel a little odd to be talking as though we just met. But anyway, we'll work our way through that and get to I think what will be a very interesting conversation for folks about Sarah and her role at n-Lorem and why Sarah's here and how much of a personal stake she has in this process as well. So, Sarah, I guess we should begin at the beginning. Where did you grow up? In the South?
You don't even know this about me, Stan. I was born in Kentucky, actually.
Well, it's South. That's South. Yeah. They play basketball there, but not as well in Indiana. But they play.
Not quite. No, so I actually moved around the East Coast in Kentucky, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and Ohio.
Yeah. Cool. And I think maybe your parents are both retired now, but what did your parents do as you were growing up?
Yeah, my mom was a nurse in an oral maxillofacial surgeon's office for some time when I was really young, and my dad was a pharmacist, so he was director of pharmacy at many different hospitals. So that's kind of how we moved around and ultimately ended up at Cardinal Health before he retired.
Well, so you were exposed to medicine from the earliest period of your life, I suppose. And did that inform you about what sort of career you wanted to sort of build for yourself?
Not necessarily, honestly. I mean, I think I learned a little bit about what my dad did, but I think I really always was more inclined towards kind of the math and science. I mean, that definitely interested me more, and so that's kind of what I went to focus on in college. And then that's where I learned about genetics. And I think that's really kind of where, who knew I'd be here today, but that was the beginning of me being like, wow, there's something really cool that I think I could really find a career in.
Yeah. So this is an undergraduate course in biochemistry or cell biology or something like that.
And yeah, both of those, but really it was really genetics. Like it was straight, like human genetics too. And then, I had actually my brother-in-law was in an MD Ph.D. program as well at the University of Pittsburgh. And so one summer when I was in college, he kind of let me shadow him as an undergraduate and worked in the lab of a gentleman working on muscular dystrophy. And, really was like, this is fascinating. I also had the chance to work at, muscular dystrophy camps that summer. So really it was kind of my first introduction to rare disease and to genetics and just to the needs of these patients. And even at the time, I mean, it wasn't really like, well, okay, now we know the gene, let's fix it. It was really just about, let's understand it more. So that's really where it started for me.
So you, in one summer, you got both the hard science and the hard reality of what happens to these patients clinically and the damage it does to them and their families. So.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I mean, I think I can even, it's funny you mentioned this because I haven't thought about that camp in so long, but it was just, it was so impactful. It was unbelievable. And a lot of people from this lab, went to be counselors and so it was, individuals affected by Duchenne muscular dystrophy year after year. who were just obviously very, 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 very sick. But just having such a joyous time. I mean, that's the thing. The joy you could bring to these kids' life was pretty amazing.
Yeah. And at that time, there was essentially no hope
Mhm.
for Duchenne's, right?
Yeah.
And then you went on and did your PhD at Ohio State.
I did. So I was with Karis Eng, who's really clinical cancer genetics, and so we were focused on looking at rare tumor types and trying to understand, genetics of even some of the non-syndromic type of tumor types, and ultimately finding that many of them had genetic variations. And then moved on to do a postdoc. And again, I think a lot of the exploration was thinking about for that was looking at cancer and pharmacogenetics and thinking about, again, like what is the role of genetics? So I think really, as a general principle, is like really moving towards that space of like, now, wow, look at all these different, side effects and, causation of different diseases. They have a role with genetics. And so then, I ultimately moved to GSK where, was really, again, thinking about the role of genetics in disease and in some drug discovery and development, but not even targeting the gene yet.
So at GSK, then you were in the medical genetics group in the basic sciences, or on the clinical side, or both? Or?
Yeah, so it was a pretty large genetics, and pharmacogenetics was the focus. And so really looking at most of the big drug programs and thinking about were there genetic markers for safety and efficacy. And trying to, and I think at the time thinking about like, if there's anything, are there ways to stratify patients at a minimum? So maybe you're not trying to target that variant, but you can think, let's just say we understand this particular variant led entirely to this side effect, then could we, have that as a risk factor? So that was kind of the focus of that group.
And that was your entry level job after you got your PhD.
Yeah,
And
it was
so
called Mendelian geneticist. I saw this job, it was advertised. I thought, wow, this is like, what a dream. I mean, how cool is that? How many, so yeah, and it was such a really, really great opportunity. Fantastic, strong group that they still have a really strong group there today.
that was in North Carolina, or was it inside Philadelphia?
That was in North Carolina.
Did you ever make it to the campus outside Philadelphia?
Oh yeah, I mean, a number of times.
Yeah. Well, that's the campus I built many, many decades
Yeah,
ago.
isn't it funny? I know you came before, and who knew?
And and undoubtedly that program had its inception with stuff that I introduced to the company in the 1980s. So I guess we crossed paths, though we crossed paths in I guess a different dimension or something.
Yeah.
And then you ended up working in a number of clinical CROs, or at least one anyway. What took you there?
Well, actually, it was a organizational kind of move with GSK and a partnership there. So I did end up with Parexel. I also had a short time with them, and then I also spent some time in the precision medicine group at Teva Pharmaceuticals, and then I ended up going back to Parexel, and again really thinking in their translational medicine group with a focus on rare diseases. Just really thinking a lot, then almost shifting the mindset too, is thinking about precision medicine, but then with a lot more of a focus on the patients, like what's the experience, what's a trial experience, I mean, how many times we would go through protocols and you'd be like interested in having biomarkers and tests for this and that, and you're like, literally you're going to bleed these patients dry if you actually look at the logistics of this protocol. So it was really a lot of opportunity to learn, and then take that, take what we were trying to do and to understand, and the data you needed to gather that was so important in a clinical trial, but then put it with the mindset of like, what's the actual patient? What's the family's experience day to day? So that's kind of, and I ended up at Parexel working with them.
It is interesting that people take for granted that we do rare disease trials, but you and I know that there were no rare disease trials for many, many decades. We didn't know what rare diseases were, and you were involved in a lot of the learning about how to conduct a trial when you have limited numbers of patients who are progressing and desperately ill. It was something the industry had to learn, and Parexel, among others, played a key role in that, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a huge amount of effort really trying. And I think what's so interesting is that one of the main challenges was like finding patients. It's like, so drug companies were, developing a drug for this disease that they know in principle had X number of patients. So then, then the job is like, how can we find the patients that should fit this protocol? And I think reflecting on what we do at n-Lorem, it's such an interesting difference, which I find to be so important.
Yeah. And again, a tremendous amount of learning over the last couple of decades about how to do these things that, obviously applies to what we do at n-Lorem in one fashion or another. And also the management of these patients, what it is that they require just to be cared for, which no one knew. And we at Ionis had to learn a lot about that in a number of the rare disease trials that we were doing as well. And it's just something you learn. You have to learn the hard way by doing it, right?
Yeah.
And your husband Oliver is a PhD as well, right?
He is, yeah. He is a PhD from Duke University, and he was faculty there for a number of years, and ultimately is really focused in the similar type of area as well. He's a much better scientist than I am, to be honest. He's very much more in tune with the details of the science, where I'm obviously thinking much more bigger picture.
And I guess probably the most interesting next topic would be Ethan. You have two children. How old are they?
Yes, I have my daughter Anella. She's 11. She's in 5th grade. She loves to go horseback riding and do everything that typical 11-year-old love to do. I have a son, Ethan, he's 6 now. So he was born in 2017, and he was just had a really tough go at life, honestly, the first few years, and went through a number of different, sort of major health issues, and he was diagnosed with the n-of-1 mutation in 2020. So he has a neurodevelopmental disorder, but he's a happy little guy for the most part. When he's not sick, he's healthy and he's happy, and yeah, he just live day to day. So it's a very, very different, so that's interesting. You mentioned both kids because they're just polar opposite, but honestly, they're so in tune with one another. She's like the best sister, and he's wonderful to her. He adores her, and she's really the best friend he'll always have, probably, which is pretty amazing. So
yeah. So did you know right away that he had problems?
Well, yeah, I mean, the first couple of weeks he was just not, it was all feeding. I mean, I think it's a lot of what, it's just, and so ultimately then you get this, what we hear a lot of patients go, this failure to thrive diagnosis. And I mean, even, I think that's the thing, is like, so all of a sudden, everything we've just spoke about is you're a professional. And then all of a sudden now you're in the hospital bed with your baby, and they're saying your child has failure to thrive. And you're like, what? Like, what does that even mean? I mean, literally, no idea, knew nothing about this. He's not going to survive if he doesn't get a feeding tube. And, we better bring the geneticist in. His ears look turned. His eyes are too close. His chin, you're like, oh my gosh. So yes, he had a lot of troubles. He was on a feeding tube for many, many months. He was super, super, skinny. I mean, he was skinny. He couldn't keep anything on. And I think, reflecting, I mean, he had GI problems, so he had a couple of GI surgeries. He had eye problems, he had a couple of eye surgeries. I mean, he just had, he had this and that, with most of his systems were not developed sufficiently to be able to thrive on his own. And so he, really the first year or two, the first year he was really, there were he had this major, one of the scariest things, he had just where he couldn't actually even swallow some of the time. So he would choke and he would turn blue, and then you'd have the ambulance. And it's awful, honestly. You can tell it was just reflecting on that was just like one of those things. And I can just remember finally we were just every single night we actually had, as now, I operate by like Excel sheets. We literally had on my son's door, like, okay, mom, 3 hours, Oliver, 3 hours, like just trying to survive, like everyone. So somebody up, holding him up all around the clock. And finally it was like 3 or 4 weeks of this. And we got in touch, Oliver got in touch with a GI physician on call, and she was like, pack your bags, you come into the ER, you have to, I mean, because he was literally just choking, like he couldn't somehow, we just couldn't, and you're like, what's going on? You have no idea. So yeah,
So he had a nerve conduction problem that meant that he couldn't swallow,
well,
couldn't.
I mean, honestly, maybe that's
Oh,
what it was. We just don't even know what it was. And I mean, so, but that ended up resulting in him, and there literally, it was, it's like what all these go through is like, does he have an allergy? Well, he has this, let's throw all these things at it. And so then, then he was in the hospital in like the ICU, sort of and then they ended up putting him on the feeding tube at the end of that. So that was like the first few months. And then he was on a feeding tube for a few months. He got nice and, fat, like really roly baby, big cheeks, like he should, coming from my side of the family. And then he wasn't at risk anymore of at least not thriving. Then we started to learn really what was going on, which was just, he just wasn't developing as he should.
Yeah. Well, it's a tragic story, but it's sort of the common story for children born with nano-rare diseases that we hear every day, you and I.
Literally every day.
And it doesn't make it less heartbreaking the 150th time you've heard it versus the first time, does it?
Yeah, not at all.
And there's no poignancy as poignant as it's your child. You're being told that your child is failing to thrive. I hate that term.
I know.
I would banish it from medicine if I could do that. There has to be a better way of expressing that your child is very sick.
Yeah. No, and it's, I mean, and literally we had it right last, couple of weeks. We see it with patients all of the time. And I mean, the major GI issues and just the inability to actually take on the nutrition. I mean, it's life-saving or not.
So he was, Ethan was very lucky. He was born into a loving family with two very well-educated parents, well-educated grandparents, all in some way medically knowledgeable. And yet, how long did it take to get a genetic diagnosis?
It took 3 years. So 3 years. So essentially we did have, so all of those times each, we get, so he has optic nerve hypoplasia. Okay, he's going to go blind. He has to have eye surgeries, and okay, we can deal with that. Well, no, actually he doesn't have that. He had, so then we went down all these different misdiagnoses. But each one was an important and very critical symptom of his broader disease. But even at the time, we still had multiple different genetic tests. So they did like for a GWAS SNP array, they did a methylation test. They do, different tests looking at, we had one physician who used, I think, the app that you look at faces for facial recognition. Nothing came up, and we're like, oh, phew, and then literally, I mean, during the pandemic, during that summer, I mean, I can reflect on the fact that like there's so many things where you get through this and you're like, oh, did you hear he just said that word? Oh my gosh, he's going to be okay. Like, I mean, literally it's that moment to moment. And then you're like, oh, I never said it again. It wasn't intentional, or that wasn't actually a word, or, so this whole 3 years. So we ultimately were put into the undiagnosed disease network. So we were, very privileged to be at Duke University. So had a course, all these specialists who were very much experts in their area. And finally went into this, undiagnosed disease study as a research candidate, thinking like, there's no way we're going to find anything. And then the pandemic hit and we hear nothing. So that whole, I mean, it was a good from fall 2019 through to fall 2020, I guess, that whole summer, like really that summer, I can remember in particular, everybody's like isolated from one another and we're thinking maybe he's going to be okay, no diagnosis. And then we get a call and they say, we have a diagnosis, but we actually need another sample to CLIA confirm it, because it's a pandemic, so we don't have access to the backup samples. So we're not going to tell you what it is. We can't tell you what it is now, but we need to get you guys in for more samples. So they sent some samples for myself and Oliver and Ethan. And then, it was October 17th, like a Friday afternoon at 5, we got a call from the genetic counselor and she's like, okay, do you have time to chat? I'm like, yes. And so she said, here's the gene name. We're like, I mean, never heard of it, of course. And, this mutation, we don't know anything about it. And that's it, And so we spoke to the geneticist who leads that program, who's just a wonderful, wonderful person. And, they just said the reality of it, right? I mean, really smart, wonderful people with good intentions who now have this really well, very robust data set to show us this is a causative mutation for this child, and there's nothing that we can do about it. So here's how the symptoms are, and there is an advocacy group, so we recommend you do that. And so that was kind of it. We had a chat with her, I guess, a couple weeks later, and it was a really tough time.
I'm sure it was. And it's again, this is a history you and I hear every day.
Mm-hmm.
The specialist in whatever organ, the ophthalmologist, the gastroenterologist, or this or that or the other, they all think it's a disease in their organ as opposed to a disease of the patient.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get all these fragmented efforts to potentially help, but in fact, they identify the manifestations of the problem, but don't lead you to a place where you actually, unless you get genetic sequencing.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was what finally got us there, was the full sequencing.
And while it's difficult to accept, it's also true that we are living among the most privileged, because there now is genomic sequencing that can give you answers like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think what's funny is, I mean, not funny, but reflecting back is like, there was even, I want to say maybe after 2 years or something, there was like, well, you can do this, sequencing, and I want to say it was going to be $10,000 or $15,000 out of pocket. And they're like, well, the likelihood of finding something is very low. And, so then you think all this benefit risk, we're like, well, why should we put that amount of money? And he seems fine. He just said that word, so he's going to be okay. Right. So we don't need to do that. And so, so you don't do that, so that's the thing, just that privilege and the access to things, even when given the opportunity at that point with that high cost and the rationale that it probably wasn't going to find anything. I don't know. It's always, 50-50 looking, or retrospective. You look back and you think, well,
could have done this,
should have found it earlier.
Yeah. Well, again, so little was known and so much is known in just 3 more years. It's just amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you remember the exact moment, the exact date, the exact time, the exact words when you learned what the truth was, and that Ethan has a mutation that's going to be present the rest of his days and going to have an effect that could result in cumulative problems over time.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that sometimes I don't think our parents and patients understand, that a mutation is forever, and that it is, whether we feel it or see it or know it, it's producing damage at the cellular level that will eventually accumulate and give us signs and symptoms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So Ethan's, in simple terms, what's Ethan's mutation, and why has he been so sick?
It's called DYRK1A, so it's a receptor tyrosine kinase, but it's expressed broadly. So it impacts generally, pretty much every system in his body. And it's an intronic, so it's like right near the splice site mutation. So it's a little bit more difficult to target. But mostly, most of all, it affects all of his, systems essentially. I mean, it's whether it's speech, it's balance, it's it's obviously GI, it's vision, it's, seizures, febrile seizures. He had his first seizure, actually, we were at Disney World of all places. And, it was like we had flown in, I don't know if I had told you this, but it was like we had take a 6 a.m. flight, and we're, very happy to be there in the summer. And it was like, I think he was 4 or something. And literally we were at a restaurant, and, and we didn't know, I mean, because sometimes when he does things, like, you're not sure if he's just doing things because you don't know, or if there's something actually wrong. And then next thing you know, he had a good 10-minute seizure, and they had to call the ambulance and throw stuff off the table. And so that's one of the, he's had multiple of those now. So I think that's, and many of the kids, there are about 600 kids, and with DYRK1A syndrome, none of them have his same mutation. So again, it's still an N of 1 situation where, everybody's affected slightly differently. It does seem like there's no direct kind of genotype phenotype, but there is some, at least broad understanding of what most people have, which is what I mentioned, kind of these general characteristics that are life altering like you said, the bottom line is he doesn't have a chance for an independent life, unless we do something about it. So.
And, again, bad luck. It's just bad luck that it happened. It happened in a tyrosine kinase. These are proteins that phosphorylate lots of things, and you have to phosphorylate lots of things to live. And as a consequence, he had multiple organs that were having difficulty and so on. And only now we know enough to understand that if he's got multiple system problems, almost certainly a genetic basis for that involves one of these proteins that plays multiple roles in all these organs. It's having lived through all this, it still continues to amaze me how much more sophisticated the way I think about health and disease, and how much more sophisticated my way of thinking has gotten in just the 4 years I've been doing n-Lorem. Yeah. And again, glibly about the fact that we wouldn't sense, but I'm taken aback frequently by how cumulative knowledge then enhances the pace of gains of knowledge. And we're in the process of doing that in the nano-rare space. Nothing was known 4 years
Absolutely.
ago.
It's amazing, honestly.
Yeah. So you want to just talk about how we came to meet?
Yeah, so I found this Dr. Stanley Crook on LinkedIn. Actually, Oliver found through hearing about, some of the work that you were just beginning to do at n-Lorem and in 2020, 2021. And again, being at Parexel, I was working with a fantastic group. And, that was right when Ethan had been diagnosed. And, really as a parent, sort of he, was like, well, what about this, Dr. Crook? And so thankfully I was like, well, you know what? I would love to actually run his trials. Like these are like who's going to do that? I wonder if maybe Parexel could help. And then, but really, reached out and was surprised to get a response that you were willing to chat with me. And so I think, obviously we spoke briefly about Ethan, but also then for pretty quickly was like, wow, I want to help. Like, wow, I was so inspired by you, honestly, just your, just the mission. Like you were just like, this is what I'm doing. And even though you could be, sailing the world or doing all these other fun things in your retirement, you're dedicated to people like my son. And I just, I think that was the thing. So we chatted, I think, a couple times. And eventually I was like, man, I think I have some skills and I have this personal, professional passion that maybe I could help you achieve your mission. So
yeah, and it turns out that Ethan is one of our patients. And
yeah,
and I think there's been very interesting progress by the group in Australia. I'm still not clear how you came to get them involved in trying to help Ethan.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, that's the coolest thing I think about being where I am today is like, so my boss from Teva, Iris Grossman, who had a really close friend, Anthony Akari, who is in Australia, and we were going to be both at ASHG. She was like, hey, you should just chat with Anthony. And so we ended up meeting. He saw on LinkedIn that I was in rare diseases. We're doing some work in ALS. And so we had a chat mostly just about rare disease drug development. And it was funny because at the last 2 seconds of the call, I just said, oh, and I said, yeah, I'm learning a lot about this because my son was just diagnosed with a rare disease. And so then we ended up talking for like another hour, and he's just a wonderful, wonderful, kind, interesting guy who does very similar work. And so again, he was just like, well, I mean, if you want to try to get some cells, we can do some research on this. And so again, it was, that's the thing, looking back on the pandemic, and they were actually in the middle of these huge fires in Australia. And so Ethan got the skin biopsy, got the cells grown, sent them over. They got stuck somewhere in the shipping for like 3 weeks, I want to say, but they were alive when they actually got them. So we're like, okay,
Amazing.
So that's it. Yeah. So here we are. And they've done some really good work. like you said, just to
They
try
have
to
done some
understand
really
his
beautiful
mutation. I
work.
mean,
Yeah, and I think we know what to do. So maybe the hardest question. Um, this is a hard question. Um, when you have your child that you have to live with, and you have to accept that this child, this particular child, has limits that will make his life very much different from what you hoped, and make your family's life different from what you planned. Um, how does one come to terms with that, and how do you um, continue to look for opportunities to feel hope again when in fact the situation feels hopeless?
yeah, I mean, I mean, you just grieve it for a while. I think, I think the beginning was definitely you just grieve because, like I said, every word he would say at the time, we did have a reason because we had no other reason to not think he could be normal. We just would continue to think, well, maybe this is it. Like now he's slow. He's just slow. He's going to pick it up. And so I think the reality was you just grieve that life for some time. And then finally, I think it was, partly my professional, environment too, was just really learning about like, wow, look what all these people are doing. My family is like incredibly supportive. I have a brother and sister and some nieces and nephews and their spouses, and my parents are amazing. And Oliver's mom and his family, we have a lot of family that's very, very supportive. And then we have our education. So I think it really became like, wow, it's a privilege and an opportunity to look at this child in the eyes and say, I'm going to do my darndest to do something. And I mean, honestly, it's a day to day. I mean, I'm here in San Diego right now, and the question is like, how's everything at home? Like, is everything? So it's just every day, right? So I think that you also have to level some expectations that like life is hard and there's hope because organizations like n-Lorem. I mean, and if we can't help him through n-Lorem, I'm going to find another place. And so I think that's just kind of what the purpose is that I feel like I have this obligation to him to do something. And I've got some time, so young enough that I still have a few years to be able to help him, and I'm committed to doing that for him and for his sister, who will be with him forever. And yeah, so I mean, I don't think there's an answer. I think you just have to be realistic that like it's not what you maybe thought you wanted. But I think the other thing is like I feel like you could talk to most people who have met Ethan and like my parents are perfect. They're like, oh my gosh, like he brings, what a gift, right? What a gift that he's brought to all of us. I mean, he gives us purpose. We had purpose. You always have purpose in your life, but he's like something specific. And you can feel like you can maybe try to do something about it. And it's wonderful and it's hard all at the same time.
It's called life.
Yeah, no, it's just life. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very true.
It's more than life. It's life with bad luck thrown in. So now you've entered n-Lorem. Just off the top of your head, what are the most important things you've learned?
I mean, I've learned so much. I think I've told you this. I mean, I feel like I've learned more about like, just leadership, about team building, about communication, about just being completely resilient, about, digging in your heels. And when you know how you can make a difference in people's lives by working really hard beyond harder than I ever have. And I just honestly, I just feel like it's been the most transformational experience here. I mean, to be able to help you grow this organization. And honestly, to learn from you personally, I think that's one thing that I feel like I want people to know is like, you're like Stan Crook, right? This guy who invented RNA therapeutics, who's like this legend, but you're also this like wonderful, kind, warm leader who supports our team more than anybody could ever do. And I think that's something that I feel like I'm going to continue to try to instill in our team. And it's just an amazing quality, a lot of the loyalty and other things that I've learned. So, I mean, I've learned how to do my job. So I do think, hopefully you would agree with that, right? I do think we're doing a pretty good job of actually managing the 100 growing patients. And I feel very confident. I can look every single one of them in the eye and say where they are in our process. But it's the soft things that a lot of times are harder to learn. You can't just seek out the people who's going to teach you those things in life. You can't find them yourself. So they kind of come to you. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm glad I asked the question. When I get the press, I'll listen to the answer. Not everybody does all those positive things, but
Yeah.
it's as you learn about science, you learn about medicine, you learn about patients, you learn about yourself. And as you bring others to work on a common goal, you, all of us, have a chance to learn about ourselves and then use that knowledge to do a better job tomorrow. And so that's what we're about, I think. And, I do know for a fact that cultures are different. Cultures can be created, and cultures make an enormous difference in how much productivity is yielded. And it sounds as though you very much subscribe to that as well.
Absolutely. I mean, and every single person we have here is handpicked. I would definitely say every single person has brought a new dimension to what we've done and helped us to, exponentially grow. I mean, really, it's been pretty incredible. So, I think our future is bright, and that's one of the other really interesting things, I think, is even where we are today. How many conversations were like, oh yeah, well, this is part of the plan that, was many years in the making before you even established n-Lorem. So I think that's one of the really important things too, is just, like, this isn't about just doing something and going away. I mean, this is about setting, like, we are changing the landscape of rare disease drug discovery and development, starting with the most rare. I mean, it's just like the impact, and it all starts with how we actually behave and interact with one another internally. But I mean, when we can really share that impact, like on a per patient basis, on like a, broad, even the regulatory environment, all of those things I think are really, really pretty incredible too. So, but yeah, it all starts with the culture. I for sure agree with that.
So one sort of last questions. What are the biggest surprises that you've encountered in your journey at n-Lorem?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the biggest surprises are just honestly that we continue to, see the same thing over and over and over. I mean, and I don't know why that's actually surprising, but we continue to see patients go through these similar experiences over and over and over. And I think that over time, hopefully we will continue to see things evolve. I mean, I think the other surprising in a very favorable way is just, people are drawn by this mission. And, I think the number of partners that we have, like whatever we have, 30, 40 and growing, corporate partners, all of the patient groups, all of these different, individuals that can really get behind our mission, that has been so wonderfully surprising as well. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's a really tough question, but I think honestly, I think it's been a great experience. So, I just feel really, really excited about our future and so much that we continue to learn. And I think some of the things that may feel like a surprise, we might not have so many surprises over time as we continue to learn and evolve.
Hope so. I mean, and I hope we can change the journey to diagnosis to a much more attractive, frequently encountered event. But well, thanks, Sarah, for sharing your life and the difficult part of your life, because I think it's informative to those who have to live with similar kinds of problems. Anything I haven't asked you that I should have, or anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so, Stan. I think this has been a really nice conversation. No, thank you.
Me too. And let me second everything you have said. I think the reason n-Lorem is where it is the fact that that you are here at n-Lorem and that we are as committed a team as we are and work as seamlessly and effectively as we do against, I think, incredible challenges, is a product of all the people who've chosen to join, and they've all joined for the mission. They certainly didn't join to live with the misery I caused. They joined for the mission. But anyway, a pleasure to have you. I'm sure the folks listening will find your story informative and compelling and encouraging for others who have to face similar difficulties.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Dan.
nLorem is a nonprofit committed to discovering and providing personalized experimental treatments for free, for life, to patients with genetic diseases that affect 1 to 30 patients worldwide, referred to by nLorem as nano-rare. Many of these patients progress and die without ever achieving a diagnosis. This is where nLorem comes in. They do the impossible by providing hope, and for those that they can help, free lifetime treatment. For more information about nLorem or today's episode, visit nlorem.org. Any questions can be sent into podcast@nlorem.org. Search nLorem on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook to connect with us. This video is hosted by Dr. Stan Crook and produced with the help of the following professionals. Thank you for watching.